The turbocharged Buick GNX set America on fire when people found out that its turbo six-cylinder was faster than pretty much everything on the road. But some 25 years earlier, Oldsmobile of all people had already began experimenting with a production-ready turbo car, with a V8 under the hood. And by 1962, they were ready to bring it to market. But this was no ordinary engine, requiring methanol injection to operate the turbo at the engine's high 10 and a quarter to 1 compression ratio. That made this rare Oldsmobile not only fast, but also a crazy engineering feat for the time. This was actually the world's first turbocharged production car, the 1962 to 1963 Oldsmobile Jetfire. Now, to understand why the Jetfire even existed in the first place, we need to set the stage for what was happening in the early 60s when it came to the American automobile. The compact Corvair and Falcon had just been released and were paving the way for affordable compacts stateside. At the same time, the performance arms race was beginning to heat up among manufacturers, even amongst General Motors-owned companies. Pontiac was experimenting with stuffing an independent rear suspension and a transaxle into the Tempest. Oldsmobile, which was positioned near the top of the GM food chain, felt the pressure to deliver something truly unique to the consumer so they would not be overshadowed by the likes of Pontiac and others. And their solution was in the new for 1960 Y-body GM chassis, which was the same chassis that underpinned the Pontiac Le Mans, the Pontiac Tempest, and the Buick Skylark. It was on this chassis that Oldsmobile would go ahead and build the F-85 and, later on, the Jetfire with. The Y-body chassis was a relatively compact one, and the cars built on it weren't all that big. 2,700 to 2,800 pounds was the normal curb weight for most of these Y-body cars, which made them pretty light, especially for American car standards. In the case of Oldsmobile, the F-85 and F-85 Cutlass were the cars that preceded the Jetfire. What made the Oldsmobile F-85 and the Cutlass unique compared to other Y-body cars is that they were only ever offered with a V8. Specifically, the Oldsmobile version of the venerable aluminum Buick 215 cubic inch V8. Now, the Oldsmobile engine at its core was the same as the Buick one, except for one key difference. Buick used a 5-bolt pattern around each cylinder with the heads, while Oldsmobile used a 6-bolt pattern to help relieve potential warping issues with higher compression ratios, which you'll soon see why that was actually so important for the Jetfire. Standard, the 215 cubic inch V8 in the F-85 made 155 horsepower and 210 foot-pounds of torque, while the Cutlass, which was the highest trim level of the F-85, received the Power Pack 215, which had a 4-barrel carburetor and a 10 and a quarter to 1 compression ratio, which bumped peak power up to 185 horsepower and peak torque to 230 foot-pounds. These were solid numbers out of such a low displacement engine, but they were really all that a stock 215 had to give power-wise, without needing a crazy cam and stuff like that. And as we all know, with the power wars ramping up, Oldsmobile needed to figure out how to squeeze even more power out of that little 215. And by 1962, they had their answer, the turbo rocket motor. All of the Jetfires were based on the Cutlass pillarless coupe version of the F-85. Internally at Oldsmobile, there were many discussions for how to increase the power out of the 215. With Studebaker at the time using superchargers for its R3 engines, surely that was a consideration for Oldsmobile as well. But in the end, the Oldsmobile engineering team, led by Gilbert Burrell, settled on using a small turbocharger as the most weight-conscious way to increase power while also maintaining a similar set of engine characteristics to the stock 215. Oldsmobile partnered with Garrett to help create a low-displacement turbocharger for this application, and that motor, as mentioned, would be named the Turbo Rocket, and that's what would go in the Jetfire. Now, typically to run any forced induction, whether that be a turbo or a supercharger, you want to have a lower compression engine. This is so that once you add the extra air pressure from the turbo into the cylinders, that the combustion chambers can safely accommodate said increase without unneeded detonation. In the case of the Oldsmobile 215, this wasn't what happened. In fact, they kept their already high for the period 10.25 to 1 compression with the turbocharger in the 215. So you might be wondering, how did Oldsmobile solve the detonation issue? Well, with something that they called turbo rocket fluid. Essentially, what Oldsmobile's turbo rocket fluid was a mix of methanol and distilled water that was stored in a separate tank and was sprayed into the air-fuel mix when the gas pedal was pressed hard enough. With the turbocharger running at just 5 pounds of boost, the high compression ratio made this a necessary addition. The turbo motors also got new pistons, different main bearing end caps, and finally a larger radiator. All of these changes now resulted in 215 horsepower and 300 foot-pounds of torque for the turbo motors. This was a gain of 30 horsepower and a monstrous gain of 70 foot-pounds of torque. Paired with the stock 336-to-1 rear gear ratio, the Oldsmobile Jetfire, with a 4-speed manual, could do 0 to 60 in the mid-8-second range and complete the quarter mile in 16.8 seconds. A 3-speed manual and an automatic transmission were also available for the Jetfire. Now, in terms of performance, these were considerably better numbers than the naturally aspirated cars, but they still did leave some to be desired. That rear gear ratio likely really hurt the quarter mile performance, and a gear change to 410s or something could have made a profound difference on that number. The top speed was also only around 110 as well, even with the 336s. The main way to tell a Jetfire apart from a Cutlass of the same year would be to look for the Jetfire badges on the outside, or for the 1962 year cars, look for the Jetfire's 2 chrome strips that sat atop of the hood. In 1963, the Cutlass and the Jetfire got facelifted, and that new 63 body offered a much more squared-off, muscle car-esque body design as a sign of the changing times. On the interior, the Cutlass and the Jetfire were also really similar, except for a vacuum boost gauge that was fitted on the Jetfire cars. With its turbo V8, the Jetfire was a truly innovative car for the period, but it wasn't without faults. Actually, it had 2 main problems, the first of which was the exact thing that made it so cool, the methanol injection. While today having a car that uses that is kind of a cool flex, but back then, many owners found it rather annoying because they had to top off the fluid in that tank. Otherwise, the Jetfire's failsafe would kick in and turn the boost down on the turbo in an effort to save the engine from damage in the absence of enough turbo rocket fluid. If you were aggressive with the gas pedal, a tank of the turbo rocket fluid could disappear in just a few hundred miles. Lots of owners simply ran the cars hard, and then when performance dropped because they didn't top off the special fluid, they complained to the dealership about reduced performance. In fact, many dealers ended up converting the cars to ditch the turbo entirely and just run a 4-barrel carburetor after a while, which is a shame because this quality of life mod pretty much neutered the only thing that made the Jetfire special. The other main issue was the handling of the Jetfire. Now, Oldsmobile kinda dropped the ball in this department. The same core suspension from the Cutlass made its way to the Jetfire, and in period, it was described as rather floaty and not at all that confidence-inspiring when pushed, which wasn't ideal for the king of this lineup. While the Jetfire weighed just 2,800 pounds, 4-wheel drums came as standard, so braking, while fine for the era, still wasn't great. And it also needs to be said that the Jetfire was kinda pricey. At a base price of $3,000 in 1962, add some options like AC and a 4-speed, and you were just a couple $100 away from Corvette money. By 1963, the horsepower wars were beginning to flare up again, and manufacturers were seeing that the demand for bigger cubic inch motors and more power overall were trumping the demand for the smaller, more efficient V8s like the 215 and especially like the Jetfire engine. Couple this with all the headaches that Oldsmobile had to deal with in regard to the Jetfire, they killed the car off entirely for 1964. From 62 to 63, they built just over 9,000 of these turbocharged Jetfires. But since so many people ended up converting them to normal carbureted setups, finding parts for these cars with the turbos is nearly impossible. There are very few running and driving Jetfires left that are running their stock turbo systems. We're talking like 50 to the low 100s range of cars apparently. And while the Jetfire itself wasn't the commercial success that Oldsmobile wanted, it was an important step for the progression of the American automobile. And for the time, it was a true engineering marvel, and it was the first production turbocharged car in the world. And it's one, in my opinion, that doesn't get enough credit. Now, there is some fierce debate about the Jetfire people and the Turbo Corvair owners about who built the first turbo production car. Let me know in the comments down below whose side you're on. I'd love to see some good banter on that. But otherwise, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you all for watching. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps me out. But otherwise, until next time, enthusiasts.